Hey everyone, and welcome to today's deep dive, and we are talking all about sunscreen.
Sunscreen.
It seems like one of those things that everybody
Yeah.
thinks they know a little bit about, but when you really start digging into the research
Right.
and the articles you sent over, it's like, oh, there's way more to this than I thought.
It's a surprisingly nuanced topic.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that's why we're here today.
Yeah.
We're going to unpack it all. So if you are ready to really level up your sunscreen knowledge from sunscreen 101 to sunscreen PhD.
I love it.
This is the deep dive for you.
Let's do it.
So we've got your stack of articles here. I've got so many notes, but just to kick things off, maybe we can start with one of the biggest myths out there. And I'm curious to get your take on this because I've definitely fallen for this one myself. That lower SPF will help you tan faster.
Yeah.
Have you heard this one?
Oh, yeah, definitely heard that one. And it's one of those things where I think people maybe want to believe.
Right.
Because it would be nice if it were true.
Right. It would make life so much easier.
Yeah, exactly. If you could just slap on a little SPF 15 and get that, golden glow quicker,
right?
Wouldn't that be nice? But unfortunately, it's not quite how it works. And actually, one of the articles you shared, the one from Dermatology and Skin Health, kind of touches on this.
Okay.
The kind of core issue here is that SPF, or sun protection factor, it really only focuses on UVB rays. And, those are the rays that are primarily responsible for sunburns.
Okay.
But when we talk about tanning, UVA rays are the main culprit there.
So wait, are you telling me I could be applying SPF 30 religiously thinking I'm being so good,
yeah,
and those UVA rays are still sneaking in there and doing their thing?
That's exactly it. And that's why it's so important to look for broad spectrum protection on your sunscreen, because SPF by itself is really only telling you part of the story.
Okay, so broad spectrum, that's what we need to look for. But let's go back to SPF for a second, because I always get confused about this. Does that mean SPF 50 is twice as strong as SPF 25? Is that?
I wish it were that simple.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's not quite that linear, and the Badger Bomb article you sent had a really interesting way of explaining this.
Okay.
They talk about how SPF is really about the percentage of UV rays that are blocked, not the strength of the block. So think of it like this. Imagine sunlight as this stream of tiny photons just trying to reach your skin.
Yeah.
A higher SPF is kind of like putting up a stronger shield that blocks a greater percentage of those photons. But it's not like a perfect impenetrable wall.
Okay, that makes sense. So I shouldn't assume that SPF 100 is giving me double the protection.
Exactly. It's not a guarantee.
I love SPF 50.
Yeah, and that's why no matter what SPF you choose, reapplying frequently is still super important.
Got it. It's not just a one and done type of deal.
Not at all.
Okay, so we've got to reapply. We've got to look for broad spectrum. But I will admit, I don't know a ton about how sunscreen actually works, the science behind it. I kind of just slap it on and hope for the best.
I think a lot of people can relate to that.
But that Dermatology and Skin Health article did mention different types of sunscreen, and I was really interested in learning more about that.
Yeah, so there are actually two main categories of sunscreen that we should talk about: mineral sunscreens and chemical sunscreens, and they work in very different ways.
Okay, all right, let's break it down.
Okay.
So we've got mineral and we've got chemical sunscreen, and they actually work really differently.
They have very different mechanisms of action. So with mineral sunscreens, you're talking about ingredients like zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, and these act as kind of a physical barrier on your skin.
Okay.
So they're like tiny little mirrors reflecting the UV rays away. And one thing that always kind of blew my mind when I learned about this is that they often use these things called micronized minerals in sunscreen. Have you heard of this?
Micronized minerals? Is that shrunken minerals?
Kind of like it. So basically they take those minerals, zinc oxide and titanium dioxide, and they grind them down into super, super fine particles. Think smaller than the width of a human hair.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And the reason they do that is it allows the sunscreen to go on much smoother.
Oh, that makes sense, because I know zinc oxide in particular can be kind of thick and pasty.
Exactly. So those micronized particles, they help prevent that kind of chalky white cast that you sometimes get with mineral sunscreens.
That's good to know. Okay, so we've got our tiny little mineral mirrors, but how about those chemical sunscreens? What's going on there?
So instead of reflecting UV rays, chemical sunscreens actually absorb them.
Okay.
So they work by absorbing the UV energy and then converting it into heat, which is then released from your skin.
Interesting. So they're like little tiny heat shields.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They're like UV sponges, soaking up those rays and dissipating them as harmless heat.
That is so cool. Okay, so we've got our physical blockers and our absorbers, but what about expiration dates on sunscreen? I feel like this is something that like nobody really knows, but everyone has an opinion on.
Oh, for sure. I mean, we've all been there, right? Digging through our beach bag, finding that half-empty bottle of sunscreen from who knows when.
Exactly. And wondering like, is this still good?
Right. Is it going to protect me or is it just going to make me smell weird?
Right.
Well, the good news is that the FDA actually requires sunscreen to remain effective for at least 3 years. So even if you see a shorter expiration date on the bottle itself.
3 years.
At least 3 years, yeah.
That's way longer than I would have thought.
Right, and the reason for that is that they do a lot of rigorous testing to make sure that those active ingredients are going to stay potent and effective over time.
That makes sense. Although I will say, I did find a bottle of sunscreen in my beach bag from probably 2 summers ago, and it's definitely like changed color. It doesn't look quite right.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, even though sunscreen might technically be good for 3 years, if you notice any changes in the color or the consistency or if it starts to smell off,
Right.
it's definitely a good idea to just toss it and get a new bottle.
Better safe than sorry.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've tackled SPF myths, the science behind how sunscreen actually protects our skin, and even expiration dates.
But what about some of the concerns I've heard about certain sunscreen ingredients? Like, are they really bad for you? Let's dive into that right after this.
Okay, so before the break, we were starting to get into some of the concerns that people have about certain sunscreen ingredients, and I know that's something that you hear about a lot.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic these days, and it's understandable that people want to be cautious about what they're putting on their skin.
Absolutely. So let's talk about it. That Harvard article that you shared mentioned some specific ingredients that tend to raise red flags, like oxybenzone, for example. What's the deal with that one?
So oxybenzone is a chemical UV filter. It's in a lot of sunscreens, and the concern there is that it might be what's called an endocrine disruptor.
Endocrine disruptor. Okay, that sounds a little intense. What does that even mean?
Basically, it means that it could potentially interfere with our hormones, and there have been some studies that have shown that oxybenzone can have these effects in, like, lab settings.
Okay, and I have heard that, and that does sound a little scary, I have to admit.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's something to be aware of, but here's the thing. Most of those studies were done on rats, and they were giving those rats extremely high doses of oxybenzone, like way more than a person would ever get from normal sunscreen use.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the Harvard article actually put it in perspective. They said that you would have to use sunscreen every single day for something like 277 years.
277 years.
Yeah, to get the same dose that they were giving those rats in the lab.
Okay, well, that puts things in perspective a little bit. I don't think I have to worry about that.
Right, exactly. And when you look at the research that's been done on humans, there really haven't been any conclusive findings that show a link between typical sunscreen use and those negative health outcomes.
Okay, so it sounds like more research is probably needed.
Yeah.
But for now, maybe no need to panic.
Exactly. It's always good to stay informed, read those labels, talk to your doctor, but I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. What about nanoparticles, though? There's another one that I see pop up in discussions about sunscreen ingredients, and it honestly just makes me think of like tiny little robots like invading my body, which I know is not how it works, but
I can see why you would think that it does sound kind of sci-fi, doesn't it?
it really does.
But the reality is actually a lot less exciting. So remember we were talking about those micronized minerals earlier, the zinc oxide and titanium dioxide?
Oh, that's the ones that make the sunscreen like less chalky, right?
Exactly. So some of those particles are indeed nanosized, but the research has shown that they're actually too big to pass through the skin's outer layer, let alone make it into your bloodstream.
So no need to worry about tiny robots running around in my body.
No tiny robots. No, but it is a good question because it shows that you're thinking critically about these things.
Well, and I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the information out there about sunscreen and, what to use and what not to use. And I'm curious to get your take on this because we've been talking a lot about, blocking the sun's rays, but we do need some sun exposure, right, to get that vitamin D.
That's a really good point. And it's something that I hear come up a lot. And it's true, sunscreen can reduce the amount of vitamin D that our bodies produce.
Right.
But the thing is, most people aren't applying sunscreen perfectly or consistently enough for it to completely block vitamin D production.
That's true.
And on top of that, there are other ways to make sure that we're getting enough vitamin D, like through our diet or through supplements.
Yeah, like fatty fish eggs, like that I've heard.
Exactly. And that's why I always say, if you're concerned about your vitamin D levels, talk to your doctor. They can easily check your levels and make recommendations based on your individual needs.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the concerns around sunscreen ingredients, but let's be real for a second because some people just really like having a tan, myself included.
I get it. A tan can definitely be like a nice little confidence boost.
Right, exactly. And I did notice in that dermatology and skin health article they mentioned something called safe tanning, which seems a bit like an oxymoron to me.
Yeah. It's definitely a bit of a tricky subject because the truth is there's no such thing as completely risk-free tanning.
Right.
Anytime your skin changes color from the sun, it means that some damage has occurred. But
Not
if
to-
you are going to tan, there are definitely ways to do it more safely.
Okay, I'm all ears, spill the tea. What's the secret to safe tanning?
Well, first and foremost, you got to be using the high SPF broad spectrum sunscreen we talked about.
Before.
That's non-negotiable even if you're trying to get a tan.
Got it, SPF, always.
Always. And then on top of that, gradual exposure is key. So don't go from 0 to 100. Like, don't go from never being in the sun to spending 8 hours on the beach.
Right.
Start slow, maybe 10 or 15 minutes at a time, and gradually increase your exposure over a period of days or even weeks. And try to avoid those peak sun hours when the UV rays are the strongest, usually between like 10 a.m. and 4 p.m.
Okay, so slow and steady wins the bronze medal in tanning. I like that. What about those other tanning methods out there, though, like spray tans or lotions? Are those any safer?
Those are definitely much safer than unprotected sun exposure because they don't involve those harmful UV rays. Yeah. But it's important to remember that even those methods aren't completely risk-free.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some people can be sensitive to the ingredients in those products, so it's always a good idea to do a patch test first.
Always better to be safe than sorry.
Exactly.
Well, I feel like we've covered so much ground today. We've debunked SPF myths. We dove into the science behind how sunscreen actually works. We talked about some of the concerns around certain ingredients. And we even explored the concept of safe tanning. What are some key takeaways that you want to leave our listeners with today?
You know, at the end of the day, sunscreen is an incredibly powerful tool that we have to protect our skin from the sun's harmful rays. And it's not about being afraid of the sun. It's about respecting its power and making smart choices to protect ourselves.
Sunscreen. It's a friend, not a foe.
Exactly, a friend, not a foe. And it's not a free pass to just bake in the sun either. It's about using it in conjunction with other sun protection measures like seeking shade, wearing protective clothing. Those things are all important too.
Right. It's about having that holistic approach to sun protection.
Absolutely. And if I could leave your listeners with one final thought, it would be this. Think about how much sun exposure you accumulate over your lifetime. That pan that might seem so important right now might not seem quite as appealing when you weigh it against the potential long-term consequences.
That's such a good point. It's so easy to get caught up in the moment, but those long-term effects are definitely something to consider. Well, I feel like I learned so much today, and I hope our listeners did too. As always, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of sunscreen. We hope you learned something new today. Until next time, stay curious and stay sun safe.